Hey, welcome back to Philosophy for Flourishing, the show where we explore principles and practices for living the best, most fulfilling life possible. On our last episode, I mentioned TOSCON Philosophy for Freedom and Flourishing, the conference that we just put on here in Massachusetts, maybe a month ago now. And for today's episode, I've got a special treat. Most of the talks from that conference are not yet available to the general public. They're only available to people who attended. But I've decided to make my talk from the conference, which is Benjamin Franklin's Principles for Freedom and Flourishing, available via this show. The theme fits. It's a perfect fit, really, so decided to give it to you here. So enjoy the talk. Let me know what you think. My email is john@theobjectivestandard.com. Looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you, everyone at OSI, for pulling this thing off. Thank all of you for being here. I told Craig that if Massachusetts didn't let us have this conference, that we should stage a protest instead. And a lot of you probably know Jim Brown, a friend of mine. He said, yeah, if you do that and you get arrested, I'll pay your legal fees. So yes, should definitely do that. I want to thank our atlases and Carl Barney for helping to bring so many young people here. I've been a broke student, and I know that it's hard to come to a thing like this, and a lot of them wouldn't have made it without you guys, so thank you so much. Also, especially want to thank Eric Daniels. If you registered for this conference early, then you might have seen that originally I was slated to give the talk on history, who needs it. And when Eric began giving a course, History of Liberty course for Objective Standard Institute a few months ago, I saw this golden opportunity. I could rope him into this thing, foist my topic upon him, and give myself the opportunity to talk to you guys about the person from history whom I most admire, guy that I'd most like to have a beer with, Benjamin Franklin. So, thank you, Eric. It's often said that George Washington was first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. That's very true. But Benjamin Franklin was first in everything else. He was the first, so far as I know, to propose that the turkey be America's national bird. First, to remind us that beer is proof that God loves us and wants us to be happy. And really the first to cast the mold for the American ideal, that a free man may rise as high as his ambition will take him. He started from nothing, created a fortune by the age of 42, and retired so that he could have fun playing with electricity. Turned what was then, is this too low? Okay. Turned what was then a pastime, a curiosity, into a full-fledged science, paving the way for all of the incredible electrical devices that we're using right now, everything that we rely on. Then already the most famous scientist in the world, he became its most famous statesman. Without his diplomacy in France, it's unlikely, if not outright impossible, that America could have prevailed over the British superpower. Then he came back to the US, played a small but very important role in the Constitutional Convention, and spent his final years fighting for the abolition of slavery. Kind of reminds me of Timothy Sandifer. We at TOS believe that he gets so much done because he's actually like 5 people collaborating under one name. Blows my mind. His autobiography, as Robert pointed out, was the first self-development book ever written, and I think still one of the best. But it doesn't tell the whole story, because Franklin never finished writing it. Also, there have been dozens of great biographies written on Franklin, but what these don't do, and don't really even attempt to do, is isolate and spotlight the principles that made Franklin so successful in his life. So that's what I want to do today. I've tried to boil down everything that I've learned about Franklin, I love him, I've learned a lot, into 5 principles that you can take away and apply in your own life to increase your own success, to increase your happiness in life. So I'm going to share some stories about Franklin, some stories about me and how his ideas have impacted me, and hopefully give you some ideas for how you can succeed in your own lives. So principle number 1, industry need not wish. Franklin became the most famous scientist in the world, but he had only 2 years of schooling. How is that possible? Well, of course, back then, schools were not yet in the business of melting the minds of children, so there was that. I was going for him. Also, the book of human knowledge was a bit slimmer back then. Alchemy was still considered a legitimate science, and people used cocaine as cough medicine. This is a Bernstein family recipe here in Alchemical Symbols. Setting those things aside, though, it's really important that we note that Franklin's first love was books, loved books. By the age of 12, he had read every book in his home, and then he made a friend who worked at a local bookstore, who let him sample the merchandise. And he would take books home, and he'd stay up all night reading because he had to return the books in the morning. I hope I don't sound too curmudgeonly when I say that I think if kids did this these days, most parents would probably be a bit suspect of the reading material. They want to know what's going on. His bookish inclination also made him extremely ambitious to become a tolerable English writer. This is what he most wanted when he was young. But he didn't just set a goal and hope that it would come true. He developed a system to make it almost inevitable that he would succeed. What did he do? He found essays that he really admired, typically from The Spectator, and he'd write down short hints at the essential ideas in each paragraph or sentence. He'd write these hints down, he'd set them aside for a few days or sometimes a few weeks, and then he'd come back to them and try to rewrite the essay as best he could, using his own words, whatever words came to mind. Then he'd take whatever his finished product was and compare it to the original and see how well he did, see where he could compare. Sometimes he patted himself on the back, said, I did a little bit better here than they did. Not often. But he learned a lot by doing this, by pushing himself to become what he said was a tolerable English writer. In fact, with years of practice and just constant improvement, constant focus on improvement using this system, he became, in the words of literary critic Carl Van Doren, the best writer in America. This is proof that this system worked. And this idea, this guy's getting a lot of love at this conference. This is James Clear, his book Atomic Habits. You've probably heard something like this before, that we don't rise to the level of our goals, we fall to the level of our systems. So this is the first idea I want us to take away from Franklin's life and his accomplishments. What systems can we implement in our own lives to make achieving our goals practically inevitable? Say you want to master the guitar. Well, perhaps every day when you wake up, or every night, or both, when you fall asleep, you rehearse in your head some difficult passage of music that you're looking to master. This is a similar technique to the one that Michael Phelps used to win so many gold medals. His coach would say, put in the tape. And that's what he'd do. He'd put in the tape. He was rehearsing in his own mind the perfect swim from the moment that he jumped in to the moment that he was on the podium. Everything, every little move. He had it all rehearsed in his head. And he'd play that tape first thing in the morning when he woke up, first thing at night before he went to bed. Or perhaps you want to be a real estate agent. Well, you could use a technique, a system similar to that used by Andrew Carnegie when he was a telegraph boy. He memorized the street names and all the business locations so that he could easily get from one to the other, and he would know exactly where he was going at all times. So what systems can you use to achieve your goals in life? We don't rise to the level of our goals, we fall to the level of our systems. The other key aspect of Franklin's industry that I want to point out is his incredible independence. You can work really hard at doing something that other people tell you to do, but it might not be all that productive. In fact, it might be extremely destructive. Franklin was extremely independent in all aspects of his life. Industry, real industry, requires independent thinking. Franklin's father originally wanted to devote his son as the tithe of his sons to the ministry. He wanted him to go and become a priest. Well, from what we know, Franklin's rather irreverent nature led his father to scuttle that plan. And when that didn't work, he wanted to train him to be a candle or soap maker, just like him. That didn't work out either. Franklin wasn't interested. He wanted to follow that bookish inclination, and in time he was indentured to his brother, who was a printer, who started what was only the second newspaper in the colonies. This printing business really dovetailed with his bookish inclination, with his love of the written word of communication. He was extremely independent in becoming a better printer and a better writer. We've already talked about the system. What else could he have done, though? What else did he do to become America's greatest writer? One of the things he said that helped him immensely in improving was becoming a vegetarian. Not so much because of the diet. We had Doug McGuff earlier. He probably wouldn't recommend becoming a vegetarian. But Franklin did gain some tremendous advantages from this. He did it because he went to his brother, when he was indentured to his brother. Part of the agreement was that his brother would pay his room and board being food. And so he went to his brother and said, "How much are you paying for my food right now? Give me half of that, and I'll pay for my own food. I'll do it myself." He was able to do that and spend only half of what his brother gave him, so a quarter of what his brother was spending, and use the rest to buy books. And then on top of that, becoming a vegetarian, he was able to gain this other great advantage. While the other apprentices went home to have lunch, Franklin would sit down at his desk, have a glass of water, a biscuit, some raisins, and then he'd get right to reading. And in this way, he was able to teach himself math. He didn't learn math very well when he was at Latin Grammar School here in Boston, which you guys can visit if you have time. So he taught himself math. He taught himself ship navigation. He also read John Locke's essay concerning human understanding just on his lunch breaks, at work. It's fun reading, light reading, good way to pass the time. And he taught himself logic in this way. There's a great quote from Atlas Shrugged that I think captures Franklin's approach to work. "All work is creative work if done by a thinking mind, and no work is creative if done by blank who repeats in an uncritical stupor a routine he has learned from others." So my questions to you for Industry Need Not Wish are you being first-handed in your choice of career and how you approach it? What systems can you implement to make your success inevitable? All right, principle number 2. When you're good to others, you're best to yourself. Franklin took this rigorous approach to self-improvement and applied it to creating mutually beneficial associations, mutually beneficial organizations. He created Philadelphia's first firefighting company, its first insurance company, its first hospital, its first university, still open today, University of Pennsylvania. How did he do it? What does it mean to be good to others? Does it mean to sacrifice our goals for other people? Or ask others to sacrifice for us? Well, we have to look to Franklin's example. What did Franklin do? He started what he termed a multi-level marketing company in which he would sell printers to his friends, and then they'd have to sell 10 printers to their friends, and they'd have to sell 10 printers to their friends, and so on and so forth. Pyramid scheme. No, just kidding. He went into franchising, actually. So today we think of Ray Kroc, the man behind McDonald's, as the father of franchising. Well, about 200 years ago, 200 years before Ray Kroc, there was this guy, Benjamin Franklin, that went into franchising. These journeyman printers who would love the opportunity to go into business for themselves, who were very industrious and hardworking like him, his friends in many occasions. And so what did Franklin do? He bought the equipment and the supplies to set them up in business in other colonies. He set them up in business, and then for a period of 6 years, they would split the profits. He'd get a cut of the profits. And in this way, he vastly increased his own wealth. He also vastly increased the wealth of his partners. And we're not just talking material wealth either, spiritual wealth as well. He made great friends by doing this. He also increased his knowledge of and interest in the other colonies. And that was really important when he later became postmaster of the US. So the spiritual element is also really pronounced in Franklin's first association building effort. He realized shortly after becoming a printer that he could greatly benefit by regularly interacting with other ingenious young men. And so he built his junto. They would meet every Friday, and they would discuss things like politics, morality, and science. And every week, they'd pick a question that they wanted to answer the following week. And all the members would go home, and they'd read about that subject for a full week, such that they could better understand it and bring more to the table for the conversation. So this is a mutual improvement in society. And they talked about things like, does slavery increase our country's wealth, or does it decrease it? And is it moral? Is it just to revolt against a king who violates our rights? Is it possible in our life to achieve moral perfection, or is it impossible? And Franklin said that this was the best school in the colonies at the time for studying these subjects. He built his own school, in effect, one that he didn't have to pay for. Not only did they benefit on this level of gaining knowledge together, they also recommended each other's businesses. Oh, you need a printer? I know this guy, Ben Franklin, he's great. Oh, you need a surveyor? My friend Nicholas. Oh, you need a website built? My friend Kyle, he's perfect. After all, this was long before Wix and Squarespace made that easy to do. So for about a year, I've been teaching a writing course at Objective Standard Institute, and I've long told my students, get an accountability buddy. Someone who can keep you accountable to your goals. You can critique each other's work, give each other feedback, hold each other accountable. And when the pandemic hit and I myself was feeling rather disconnected from a lot of people, I realized that I was in the perfect position to build my own writer's junto. So that's what I did. I created what's called the Republic of Letters, and we meet on a regular basis and we discuss topics for writing, pitch ideas, talk about how to be more persuasive. And it's been really productive for all of us. It's been a lot of fun. So TosCon, though, is a junto building mecca. There are all these people around us. I've talked to people that are in engineering, that do minute engineering, have done minute engineering at Bell Labs. I talked to a guy, Mike Gustafson, who started Atlas Academy here in Massachusetts. He's spearheading this incredible Montessori school effort. There are so many intelligent people doing so many things. They're so creative. And I'd say use this opportunity to your advantage. Whether you want to start a study group to go through the classics, or you want to build your next business partnership, or maybe meet your soulmate, as these two did at our last conference. Principle number 3, sin is not hurtful because it is forbidden, but it is forbidden because it's hurtful. So Franklin had a very different conception of morality than did most other people at the time. And this is evidenced, I think, really well in a story about him when he was young. We talked about how his father wanted to devote him to the ministry. Well, he was very irreverent. He didn't pause at questioning things that others considered sacrosanct. So Ben's father would say grace, and often he was very long-winded. He would go on for a long time. He'd say grace sometimes both before and after the meal. And this is the guy, Benjamin Franklin, who we're talking about, who's all about industry and efficiency and making things quick and easy. Well, he said to his father, well, we are getting our food out of these casks. We've got salt cod and salt meat, and we take some out and you put it on the plate and we eat. I got an idea. Why don't you just say grace over the whole cask once and for all? It'd be this vast savings of time. His dad didn't go for that, so far as we know. But Franklin grew up in this religious household, but he very early on questioned the dogma. He didn't think it was either instructive or productive. It didn't build moral character. He said, I grew convinced that truth, sincerity, and integrity in dealings between man and man were of the utmost importance to the felicity of life. The moral is the useful. It's as useful to be moral as it is to have business acumen, as it is to be able to do financial modeling, like Mitchell Earle was just talking about, as it is to understand physiological headroom. think we tested our physiological headroom last night at the concert, those of you who went. I know I certainly did. And I learned that this group has a lot of area under the curve, probably more than any other group at a philosophy conference. Two of the guys in the band actually were my childhood friends. And they came up to me after, "This is a philosophy conference? You sure?" I think this principle about the moral being the practical is well illustrated in the story of London's early stock exchange, actually before the official stock exchange existed. In the 17th and 18th century, London courts actually refused to enforce contracts between brokers and their clients. So fraud was technically legal. You could make a bunch of money off an investment for your client, take that and go out and buy the best Rolls-Royce carriage they had, or the best, latest Apple pocket watch, whatever you wanted. The courts weren't going to enforce the contracts. So why was fraud extremely rare as it was? There was very little fraud at this time. Well, I think that it's captured, the answer to that question is captured in the motto of Jonathan's Coffee House, which was the busiest coffee house, meeting place of brokers and traders at the time. They would meet there and they would conduct their business. And the motto there was, "My word is my bond." My word is my bond. Moral character, my integrity, that is my greatest asset in life. If I don't have that, I don't have anything. Morality is incredibly useful. It's not some dictates on a tablet handed down from on high, something without rhyme or reason. Franklin, on some level, however dim, recognized what Rand later made crystal clear, that the purpose of morality is not to teach you to suffer and die, but to live and enjoy your life. There's a natural standard of morality. It's what's good for man's life on the whole. And because he had a different standard, he couldn't follow the same map that everyone else did. He was going in a different direction. He needed his own map. And so he created his own. These are some of Franklin's 13 virtues. And you can see here, again, firsthand, his independence, even in the realm of morality. He wasn't going to simply accept what others gave him. So temperance, eat not to dullness, drink not to elevation. Order, let all your things have their places. Let each part of your business have its time. That's kind of like time block. We're going to hear about that tomorrow from Cal Newport. Resolution, resolve to perform what you ought, perform without fail what you resolve. So Franklin, here again, created a system for perfecting his moral character. He was incredibly ambitious to do this as well. And here again, he's relying on a system. Rand has a phrase that I think captures his dedication to virtue perfectly. Moral ambitiousness. Being ambitious to build your own moral character. He was morally ambitious. She used this as a synonym for pride. And pride at the time, of course, was thought to be a sin. Pride goeth before the fall. Well, Franklin had a pretty different conception on this as well. Most people dislike vanity in others, whatever share they have of it themselves. And here he's using vanity as a synonym for pride. But I give it fair quarter wherever I meet with it, being persuaded that it is often productive of good to the possessor and to others that are within his sphere of action. And therefore, in many cases, it would not be altogether absurd if a man were to thank God for his vanity among the other comforts of life. I love that. So what is the basis of virtue? What do you take to be the basis of virtue? What is your conception of the good? And is that serving to help you, or is it hindering your life? And are you being morally ambitious? Are you being ambitious about building your own moral character? Principle number 4. Wealth is not his that has it, but his that enjoys it. What are you going to do with this success that you're building? You're using all these principles to build a successful life. Are you just going to build a treasure so that you can sit on it like Smaug the dragon? What do you want to do with it? I started thinking about this question when I began writing an article on Franklin for the Objective Standard, which my friend Pete Masterson, thank you so much, has turned it into an ebook. If you guys are interested, you can get it free on our website at the URL on your handout and on this slide. And one of the questions that really helped me get at this principle, wealth is not he who has it, but he who enjoys it, is the question, what did I do as a child that I really enjoyed but no longer do? What did I used to do and love but don't do anymore? And for me, it came down to playing music with my friends. My friend Mark, who's here, who I've known since I was 3 years old, every weekend we would be jamming 8, 10, 12 hours, trying to perfect our music. We absolutely loved it. And at some point, I decided to go to college for audio engineering, studied and went to work in New York City and then in Nashville, worked on the road with bands, and music became my job. It was fun for a long time. I learned a lot. I got to see most of the US and parts of Canada. But I had very little time to play and very little motivation to play at that point. And I realized that this really isn't working. I'm hundreds of miles from my friends. I can't do this anymore. And I thought about Franklin. I mean, he had all these odes to prudence and to frugality, and he became extremely wealthy. But Franklin retired at 42. Why did he do that? He didn't need to do that. He could have stayed in his business and continued building his wealth, right? But he said he wanted to give himself only the things that he would enjoy doing to do, only those things that he chose. He understood that wealth is a tool for freedom. It's a tool for doing more of the things that you enjoy, or having more fun in life. So what did he do? He went and played with electricity and came up with our unified theory of electricity that we have today and fully rely on. In his book, another guy who's getting a lot of love at this conference, Greg McKeown, in his book Essentialism, Greg McKeown talks about how play is absolutely essential to the life of the essentialist, someone who's focused on having the greatest impact in their field, greatest impact they possibly can. Play increases our creativity, it reduces stress, it makes us better able to solve problems. Albert Einstein said that playfulness was more important to his ability to solve problems than was his ability to absorb information. He said creativity is intelligence having fun. And that's what Franklin was all about. He was always having fun. He didn't wait to retire to have fun. He didn't wait until he was there having fun with electricity to do that either. Pretty much his entire career was an example of him having fun. So the way that he acquired his first newspaper illustrates this fact really well. He decided he was going to start a newspaper in Philadelphia, and when he was about to go start it, his former employer, Samuel Keimer, found out and started a competing newspaper, sort of drying up the market for a newspaper. So Franklin, what did he do? How did he respond? Well, Keimer purported to instruct his readers by reprinting entries from an encyclopedia. And in his very first publication, he made the great mistake of printing an entry on abortion, giving Franklin a nice foothold to take advantage of. From the day he began writing, Franklin was a practicing humorist. So what did he do? He started writing letters to the editor at the only other Philadelphia newspaper. And these were written under the pen names Martha Careful and Celia Shortface. And they expressed great dissatisfaction with the way that Keimer had exposed the secrets of our sex in that audacious manner. And they were so entertaining that they quickly siphoned all of Keimer's readership over to the other paper. And within a year, Keimer's paper was bankrupt, and he agreed to sell it to Franklin, who then turned it into the most successful newspaper in the colonies, as he would later do with his Poor Richard's Almanac, which I could tell the story of that as well, but we don't have time. If you're interested, it is in that ebook that I mentioned. Franklin, it turns out that his sharp wit was the only tool that Franklin ever really needed, the only weapon he ever really needed. Later, when he was trying to solve the imperial crisis, trying to solve this conflict between Britain and the US, because that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to resolve this. He thought it'd be, for a long time, he thought it'd be better for all if the war didn't happen. So he wrote a piece called Rules by Which a Great Empire May Be Reduced to a Small One. And it was an instruction manual to ministers in Parliament telling them exactly how to destroy colonial relations. If you want to destroy colonial relations, ensure that you govern us by more severe laws. Make sure that you don't give us equal rights. Don't give us any representation in Parliament. He wrote another called Edict by the King of Prussia. And this was so realistic that many people took it for an actual edict. He wrote as King Frederick. And he said, well, you know, Britain was established under the august protection of the Prussian Empire, originally by Prussian people. And so it's time to pay the piper. You guys need to start paying these taxes, which looked suspiciously like the taxes that Britain was then levying on the Americans. So anyone who has seen the Babylon Bee knows the power of satire to move ideas forward. Inspired by Franklin, I decided to take a stab at satire myself with my friend Keith, who's also here. About 2 years ago, we wrote this piece, Bernie Sanders and AOC Release Plan to End Thanksgiving. And just as an example of how productive having fun can be, this thing was so popular that the traffic actually crashed our site for a while. So a couple years ago, when I was thinking about all this, and I realized that I really need to follow this principle of wealth is not he who has it, but he who enjoys it, I decided to move back to New England. And when my realtor said, well, there's this place called Franklin, and I started looking into it and found that it was the first place in America named after Benjamin Franklin, I said, you can cross all the other towns off the list. This is the one. So we moved back to the Northeast so I could be closer to my friends, and on top of that, everywhere I go, I get to see images of Franklin. He's on my mail from the town. He's even on my trash can. There's also a really interesting story behind our library, and I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A if you're interested. So we started jamming again in this concrete cube. It was really fun, but it sounded really bad. And again, thinking about Franklin's principle, put some money and some sweat equity into this basement and turned it into a small recording and rehearsal space. So thank you, Franklin. All right, principle number 5, force shites upon reason's back. So all the other founders, for the most part, most of them at least, came to politics through law. Adams, Patrick Henry, Madison, Hamilton, they're all lawyers first. Franklin, by contrast, was only a printer, but he was better prepared in many ways than most of the others. He learned in his writing to pare his thinking down to essentials, which really amplified his ability to communicate with large audiences. He thought that writing should be smooth, clear, and short. And this is exactly what he needed to communicate with the mass audiences of his Pennsylvania Gazette and his Poor Richard's Almanac. He also fully realized that rational argument is the only means of changing other people's minds, but that it takes a long time. Because in fact, we cannot change other people's minds. All we can do is plant the seed. People have to change their own minds. And so, for instance, he had the idea of establishing a night watch for Philadelphia to better protect the rights of its citizens. Well, he couldn't just go into Congress and build a coalition and get a law passed. What did he do? He started talking about this with his friends in the Junto. They started talking about it with people in other clubs. Eventually, this got into the general population, and in a few years' time, a law was passed to establish a night watch. He understood, as Hugo said, that there's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. But he also understood how to cultivate the ground such to make that time come. Third, he understood that outright confrontation is not very productive. It doesn't work. You know, you can argue with people till you're blue in the face. Typically doesn't move them. When he was young, he loved to do this. He loved to get into scuffles with people and to try to back them into corners. He was very good at this, to getting them to admit to contradictions in their thinking and this and that. He loved arguing, but he realized that he wasn't really making any friends. He was just frustrating people and he wasn't getting anything done. None of his measures were moving forward. He said, as the chief ends of conversation are to inform or to be informed, to please or to persuade, I wish well-meaning, sensible men would not lessen their power of doing good by a positive, assuming manner that seldom fails to disgust, tends to create opposition, and to defeat every one of those purposes for which speech was given to us. I mean, how many of us are truly persuaded by a know-it-all? Somebody who can build these knockdown arguments that are unanswerable in any way, shape, or form. Is that really persuasive? At TOS, I've had the opportunity to speak with a lot of really great writers, people that are very persuasive, very good at what they do. And recently, I had the pleasure of speaking with Virginia Postrel. And Postrel was for a long time, she was the editor-in-chief of Reason magazine. And one of the things that she said in our conversation, I think, is really relevant and really is the same as this principle that Franklin gave us. She said, the besetting flaw of people who are interested in writing about liberty is thinking that you already have all the answers, that you understand the whole world and how it should be, that you've simplified the world down to a formula. But you don't know it all. No one knows it all. No one ever has known it all. The world is complex, and that's a strong argument for protecting liberty. There isn't somebody on top who has universal knowledge and can direct everything. So you need to have curiosity and humility. Just as force is antithetical to reason, reason is ineffective when we try to use it to shove our ideas down other people's throats. Doesn't work. A friend of mine calls this trying to brute force hack someone else's mind by creating this unanswerable argument. Another guy I've had the pleasure to speak to recently, best-selling author Adam Grant, most recently wrote the book Think Again. And in it, he talks about the measles epidemics that have erupted in Canada in recent years. Well, parents have become convinced that vaccinations give kids autism. And doctors have been very unsuccessful in a lot of places of convincing them otherwise. Except for one guy, this guy, Arnaud Gagnon. So he's become known as the vaccine whisperer. And people wanted to know why. Why is it that he has such a great success rate when he goes in to talk to people? Like 9 times out of 10, the people leave and they get their kids vaccinated. And it turns out that Gagnon has a background in motivational interviewing. He asks questions. He affirms their autonomy. He doesn't question their moral character. Instead, he says, I know that you're trying to do what's right. I know that you want the best for your kids. And he walks them through these confusing questions and answers them. And he's not the sage on the stage, he's the guide on the side. So we who want to help others understand the ideas of freedom and flourishing could take a page from Gagnon, and we could take a page from Grant, and we could take a page from Franklin. I talk more about this in my course, How to Write Powerfully in Defense of Liberty. So if you're interested, check that out. I think we've got another one coming in September. So to recap, industry need not wish. Are you being first-handed in your choice of a career and your approach to it? And what systems can you use to make success inevitable? 2, when you're good to others, you're best to yourself. Sorry, a little delay. How can you be best to yourself by being good to others? What problems can you solve by building win-win relationships? And sin is not hurtful because it is forbidden, but it is forbidden because it's hurtful. What do you consider to be virtuous? And are you being morally ambitious in your life? Wealth is not his that has it, but his that enjoys it. What did you do as a child that you no longer do? And are you protecting time for play in your life today? And force shites upon reason's back. Are you persuading people or are you berating them? Do you give people the opportunity to change their own minds? And are you taking steps to be a clearer and more persuasive communicator? Thinking about and acting upon these principles has improved my life tremendously, and I hope that by doing the same, you too can become ever more healthy, wealthy, and wise. Thank you.
That was really cool, thanks. Maybe 15, 20 years ago or so, HBO had a special series on John Adams. And one of my favorite secondary characters in that was Benjamin Franklin. I thought the guy who played him was awesome. Do you have any comments, observations, or reflections on that series, how Franklin was portrayed?
I think it was awesome. It's been a while since I've seen it, and to be honest, the last I saw it was before I really did a deep dive on Franklin, so I can't really speak to the accuracy of it. I know he played a very small role, but it was fun to see him. So I'd recommend, if you haven't seen it, Paul Giamatti plays John Adams, It's excellent, and everyone should check it out. Thanks for the question.
Benjamin Franklin is quoted as saying that it is a sin to leave an unjust law unbroken. What are your thoughts on that?
That's very smart, in my opinion. I mean, I just said I'd be all for protesting lockdowns, right? So unjust laws, of course, this is contextual. You can't just run out and start breaking unjust laws regardless of your situation. You have to think, is this going to be a sacrifice for me, or is this going to serve my long-term self-interest? And if the answer is the latter, then absolutely, I think you ought to break an unjust law. To do so in a way that is effective, you might try to do it as a test case. You might find some place like Institute for Justice or Goldwater Institute, where Timothy Sandefur works, who will take your case on as perhaps a constitutional case and argue that in court. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the lecture. So, as far as I can tell, there are lots of people right now, especially on the left, who believe that founding fathers are some kind of criminals, and the whole founding of America is rigged. Therefore, we have to rebuild it. And watching that from outside is really sad, because for Ukraine, for like post-Soviet countries, USA always was a beacon of freedom. The place where you always can go, and that this country is based on the foundation of freedom, on the purpose and self-esteem. Therefore, my question is, how actually can you make everyone like you love all founding fathers? How you can turn them into hardcore fans as you who go to cities and taking photos with Franklin? So how do you make a moral case against the left in favor of founding fathers? Because it's really important.
Yeah, so I actually talked about this at some point. I think it was my interview with Andrew Bernstein for his book on heroes. And it's key, I think, to recognize their flaws, as Eric Daniels pointed out in his talk. Well, the history of America is not perfect. And it's not perfect because the people who made it were not perfect. We got lucky because in many cases their flaws canceled each other out. We got this dream team of people who, when they came together, created the best, most moral nation in history. They did have flaws, and so we ought to recognize those and give it a very objective, even-handed assessment of the founders. And in doing so, I think we make ourselves look a whole lot more credible when we talk about what was good about them. So I wrote a piece on Thomas Jefferson. It was one of the first pieces for the Objective Standard, in which I go into Jefferson's flaws at great detail. And I did that because I understand that people are coming to the founders with this context that they get from the public schools, that they're these horrible people that have this thin veil, this thin sheen of ideals. That is, they've just put that over these things like profit motive and lack of care for enslaved people. I mean, we have to look at who they really were. We have to really investigate the historical record, as Eric was saying, and understand both sides of the story, and then be able to articulate why, at the end of the day, what was essential about the founders was not the flaws that they shared with so many other people, but the incredible virtues that they embodied. Thanks for the question.
Hi. A long time ago, I wrote a poem about slavery when I was young, and I mentioned Ben Franklin, and someone said to me, "What does he have to do with it?" But my question is, so that was a nice talk.
Thank you.
But my question is about your audio engineering. Do you have any ideas or advice for learning audio engineering on your own?
Oh yeah, there's tons of great stuff out there. I mean, on your own, you could just go buy the gear and start watching YouTube videos, but there are also programs from Berklee College of Music, which is just down the street from here, one of the best colleges of music in the country, and they have all sorts of online courses you can do. There's something called ArtistWorks. There's, what's that good one for mixing, Mark?
Mix Like a Pro.
Yeah, what is that?
Mixlikeapro.com.
Oh, it's called that, okay. Mix Like a Pro. Mixlikeapro.com, you can check that out. You can just pull it down, just bend the stand. That too, yeah.
There we go. So when studying Ben Franklin's life to model our own philosophy today, what differences do you think What differences between the world he lived in and the world we live in today do you think are most important to be aware of?
That's an interesting question. Our situation is in a lot of ways similar. In fact, I think some of the restrictions that we went through in the last year are far worse than anything that the founders experienced in their lifetimes, and yet we didn't see a revolution here. Why is that? I think it has a lot to do with education, and again, Eric hit on this in his talk on pedagogy and on education here. I think that we've stripped people of the tools that they need to think really clearly about this stuff because they no longer learn history. They don't understand all the precedents that we've just set and how we're likely to see these things handled in the future. So the biggest difference, I would say, is the fact that our culture lacks the sort of principled knowledge that they need to face a massacre of rights like we've just seen correctly. Thank you. Hey, Dale.
Just a comment. I don't think you mentioned it, unless I just missed it, but Franklin taught himself to be something of an expert swimmer.
That's right. He loves swimming.
He invented a pair of swim fins. He wore them on his hands, not on his feet. I think he actually did a good bit of work to promote that activity.
That's right.
And not infrequently won some of the races, swim races in the area that he was living. There was a story of a 3.5-mile swim he did along the Thames River.
That's right.
Out of Chelsea, impressing his friends paddling along beside him with a few water tricks. Something of an athlete. We don't really think of him that way.
I think
During
it's
the
like Brad Thompson
Revolutionary
a little
period,
bit.
he was kind of an old man. He wasn't as imposing.
Think of him as a grandfather or something. But.
Not as imposing as the 6'4" Washington or the 6'2" Thomas Jefferson, and maybe wasn't thought of as being as high-minded, but a very well-rounded individual.
Yeah, in that respect, I don't know, he kind of reminds me of Brad Thompson a little, or Brad Thompson reminds me of him a little bit. It's like this guy that came up through college playing football and became a very, very astute scholar of the founders. Thank you. That was a good observation. Yeah, and it's funny too, if you go back and read some of the correspondence about swimming at the time, how people viewed it, it was like, I'm very ambitious to become a good swimmer. Today we sort of take it for granted. Like, yeah, we all learn how to swim. We're very young. Thank you. Hey, Thomas.
You indicated that you might have something interesting to say about the library in Franklin.
Thank you. Somebody took the bait. Yes. I think I have a slide here too. So the library in Franklin, how did that get started? So this goes actually to the story of Franklin in general. So in 1778, there was a town outside of Boston that had reached sort of the legal limits to become a new incorporated town. It was a group of people living together, and now they wanted to go incorporate and become a town. And so they went to Dedham, where the courthouse was, to incorporate, and they got there and they heard news. News had just come from France. Franklin has brought France into the American War on the side of the Americans. And they immediately crossed out Exeter on the deed and wrote instead Franklin. And so this town became Franklin, Massachusetts, the first town ever named after Benjamin Franklin in 1778. And about 7 years after they had founded the town, they realized, well, Franklin's never really recognized us for having named our town after him. So we had to do something about that. And they had just built a church, but they needed a church bell. So let's write to Franklin. Maybe he'll buy us a church bell. They wrote to Franklin and he said, I'm not really into this whole church thing. How about this? How about I buy you some books instead? Sense being preferable to sound. And so he bought them books, and the books in this case, on this picture here, are the collection that Franklin purchased. They were sent to Franklin, Massachusetts from his friend Peter Collinson in England, and they're still there today. You can go check it out. It's about 40 minutes from here. I'd be happy to show anyone around who's interested in going. And this whole library was built, and this is the first truly fully public library in the United States, built from the private donations of Franklin and then later the Ray family. that lived there as well. And now today, of course, it's been taken over and is run by the town via tax dollars like every other library. But Franklin started not only the first subscription libraries in the US, where people would pay a subscription, they'd become part of this club that had access to the books. He also indirectly started the first public library in the US, and he later said that he thought that this had something to do with the stand that the Americans took because they were educated. And if you look here, these books, the tan ones, those are Locke's works in 4 volumes, John Locke's works. And why is that relevant? Well, if you go back to YouTube and watch my talk from last year, you can hear me expound on why Locke was another American founding father, even though he never came to America. Long-winded answer, but thank you, Thomas.
I have a comment more than a question. I read Franklin's autobiography when I was in late high school, before I read Rand. And one of his virtues, if you combine his virtues with the due process idea earlier in the conference, he recommended that you focus on one virtue for, I think it was a month. And a week?
Yeah.
I forgot. But anyway, and then you would change your focus to another virtue and work on that one. And I've used that to like change habits. Like if you like trying to be a better communicator, you need to be a good listener. Well, what are the different things involved in listening? And there are things you have to keep track of, but you can't keep track of 9, 10 things at one time.
Yep.
So if you focus on one part of it and try to get really good at that and then change to the next part. My only problem being I never seem to get good enough at the first part. So I just eventually decided just change your focus and then you get a little bit better all the time. But that's an idea I got from his autobiography that I thought was really worthwhile.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning it. So I mentioned that he developed a system for perfecting his moral character as well, but I was hoping that somebody would ask about this. What he did was he listed his 13 virtues, and for a time he tried to focus on all 13 at once. I'm going to do all of this. I'm going to become, morally perfect. But that's pretty untenable, right? It was crow blowing in the way that Rand would put it. You can't do that. You can't split your focus between 13 things. So instead, he would track his progress on a single virtue at a time. He'd focus on only that virtue for a week. Well, actually, he'd track his progress on all of them, but he'd focus on only one of them. And you see here, this is an app. So he did this with a book with slate pages that he could erase the page and keep using. He used it throughout his most of his life. He did this, tracking his project on becoming a more virtuous person. And if you're interested, you can download Ben's Virtues on the App Store and do something like this. I actually brought this up at another TOSCon. I'd love if anyone's a developer to come up with an objectivist version of this with the objectivist virtues. It'd be cool if there was an app where you could just put in your own virtues and track your progress on those. So anyone has that skill set, let's talk. Hey, Carrie Ann.
Hi. My question has to do with the use of humor. And in Ben Franklin's autobiography, he recounts all these amazing inventions he made, like the book grabber to get to high shelves and bifocals and the Franklin stove, which it's astonishing how productive he was in inventing. But he said, I didn't do this to make money. I did this because I'm an incredibly lazy person and I want to ease my life. And I thought, that's sort of funny, but I found it irritating. I was like, don't apologize for this. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the use of humor in trying to have people be comfortable with your activities at the expense of taking pride in and making the case for the argument. So at what point does the use of humor perhaps undercut your argumentation, and do you think Franklin sometimes crossed that line or not?
Well, I think that humor has a pretty specific role, and I think the person who outlined it best was the Scottish philosopher Thomas Reid. He developed a system of philosophy called common sense realism, and he laughed at many of the other philosophers that were before and after him. George Berkeley being one. Berkeley thought, well, the only thing that is real is what we're visualizing in our minds right now. It's God is basically portraying everything, and there's actually no external world. Well, he said that there are some things that are so absurd that you can't reason with them. And so what do? You have to laugh at them. And I think there are definitely arguments to be made on most of the things that Franklin was characterizing as absurd, but he saw them as absurd. And I think he actually drew mass audiences to his causes with humor. And I think that, I follow Babylon Bee and The Onion, and I think they do a lot of the same. And a lot of times they put into just a short quip a truth that is so hard to get at otherwise. And it's so memorable and it sticks with you and you laugh every time you think of it. So I can't think of any instances where I thought his humor undercut him. I do think that there's questions about why wouldn't you want to patent your stuff and gain from that, but he also was extremely wealthy and happy to help others. So thank you. Hey, Zena.
Hi. So my question is, what's your advice on being less of a know-it-all, maybe less interested in persuading other people on a regular basis? Just your advice on how to take it down a notch.
I would say your goal should be to always be acting on the trader principle that we heard about from Rajree's talk. What value do I have to offer other people? And what value do they have to offer me? Can I learn something from them? Adam Grant recently posted, I think it was on Twitter, something like a good debate is one where you aim to learn as much as you do to persuade. So ask a lot of questions. Be really interested in what other people have to say. Don't take it for granted that you already know what their arguments are. In fact, typically we tend to simplify things down into two sides. We have these polar views of every argument. And in most cases, there are 10 or 12 or 15 different views on the argument. And the only way to really get a handle on the argument and to actually convince people is to answer their actual ideas, right? So if you don't acknowledge the various viewpoints on an argument, then you're really not going to be in a good position to persuade other people. Thank you.